this land was once home to creatures that now only exist in memory. Every year, we lose a forest area equivalent to the size of Costa Rica, as well as its species. We are facing one of the most extreme times in the history of the planet, which is the Anthropocene. Anthropocene means the effects of what humans are doing are now affecting biodiversity. So conservation is a good point to converge all of the disciplines into one single target, which is protecting the planet.
At a fundamental level, conservation and biodiversity just needs to be elevated in policymakers' minds. When we look at the planetary emergency, most people's mind tends to go to climate change, as it rightly should, but I think the story of biodiversity gets lost, and it's really not as prominent in policymakers' thinking and in their actions, and therefore it's not really prominent in the public's mind in the way that it should be.
When I was in the global south, in the tropical areas, biodiversity means everything. For people, is the means of life, is what we see every day. When we come into the global north, becomes a discipline. It maybe is a bit far from some people. We have protected areas. We have wonderful forests in some places in the world, but some others are losing and a really dramatic piece. So biodiversity is in a crisis at the moment because we need to protect it, but we need to be convinced that we need to protect it. What people don't understand is biodiversity is part of a complex web, connected, interconnected. It's a series of events, it's a domino effect. Biodiversity is what is securing food for people, for humans. Biodiversity is what is providing oxygen for all of us. So all of this, not just the ecosystem services like pollination and so on, but we have other services in the long term, in sustainability of the planet.
COP at its most basic level just stands for Conference of the Parties. So they are the parties to a UN convention that brings together not only the parties, which are national governments, but also the wide range of influencers and opinion formers who shape policy, whether that's journalists or campaign groups or scientists. COP15 was a milestone COP because it was the conference where something called the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. And really what that framework is a set of global goals and targets that all of those parties have signed up to in order to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. One of the flagship targets within the Global Biodiversity Framework is something called 30 by 30, which really means protecting 30% of the planet's land and oceans by 2030. So it's one of several targets, but it's a really ambitious one that we really need the world to achieve. And it should provide a kind of a way into lots of the other goals we have around biodiversity.
Last year, there was the COP16 in Colombia, and it has brought a very big push into putting nature into the day-to-day conversations in another scale.
Colombia itself is one of our most biodiverse countries in the world, but Cali within Colombia is the most biodiversity-rich city. From that perspective, you are emotively bringing people who are making decisions into the heart of the very thing that they want to make the decision about. In other senses, being in the heart of the jungle really brought home what we were there to talk about.
Many countries make these national plans, but only less than 20% of them actually manage to present those national biodiversity plans for the long term, which is a bit disappointing. But COP16 brought a huge platform for people who is actually engaged. Lots of passionate people about conservation of the environment, again, from different disciplines, from different backgrounds, from different nations, from different areas of expertise. So it was a very good platform to combine everybody into one single objective.
So the COPs can sometimes struggle with a disconnect. There were funding commitments, but number one, gap between what's been committed and what's actually needed to try and restore biodiversity is vast. Therefore, we're going to have to mobilise private investment and capital. And the other part is you can make these commitments in public. Do they actually then produce it? So for leading developed countries, they seemingly might be doing very well. But when you do an analysis, which we did at the Natural History Museum last year, look at the biodiversity within the protected areas designated, they're actually still faring pretty poorly. Now, the base layer is higher than the unprotected areas, but it's still declining and has been over the last 20 years. And that's where the problem is.
Can you help us understand this paradox, why this is happening, and what can we do about it?
Protected areas are essential. They are at the heart of this target. But as you say, they are clearly not working as well as they might do. They're clearly not enough. And simply hitting the 30% target isn't necessarily going to get us to where we need to be. And as you say, when we look at the global data, we can see that actually biodiversity is declining, even in these so-called safe havens. And it's in fact declining even faster than it is elsewhere, which is concerning.
So why is that happening? And this is what the policymakers need to be asking themselves. Is it because the legislation is ineffective for that particular country, because everyone's going to be different? Is it that the policing is not strong enough? Or there's another term we refer to as paper parks. So this area over here might be an area of scientific interest, and then we designate it a protected area that bumps up our percentage towards hopefully hitting that 30%. Why that particular area? Does it benefit us as humans? Does it provide us with the ecosystem services that we rely on? Because when you look at it and you look at the 30% or the current protected areas around the world, they're not protecting the areas that are most crucial to us. So what can governments do? They can take a dynamic rather than static approach. If it's going down, we need to make an intervention, do something, right? Is there a new policy that needs to be, do private need to be investing more into this? If it's going up, well then what lessons can be learned from this area that can be expanded nationally and potentially internationally?
There are all sorts of reasons why land might be, assigned as a protected area. It might have an iconic species. It might have a particularly endangered species. Some of these areas are actually iconic landscapes or, particular biomes that have been protected. But I think what's also concerning when you look at protected areas is that actually a lot of the land that delivers the most effective ecosystem services for people is currently sitting outside of those protected areas. They are often managed by local people, by communities. So when we think again about hitting that 30% target, expanding the network of protected areas, just doing what we've done before isn't necessarily going to get us the best result.
Are there examples of policies that support these local communities that you have seen to be effective?
One of those is really strengthening the capacity of those communities to effectively manage those areas. And I think a particular example of that is giving people the tools to actually monitor biodiversity on the ground. So if we can measure, if we can monitor how biodiversity is doing, we can understand, are these protected areas working? Is biodiversity genuinely on an upward trajectory? We need to tackle the root causes and the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. And one of the biggest ones of those is converting habitats for development projects, for agriculture. And there are all sorts of economic reasons for doing that. And one of the big problems that we have at the moment is that biodiversity in an intact state, healthy ecosystems, is not valued in our economic models. So it is therefore destroyed. And I think if we could find ways of valuing it, a rainforest standing rather than a rainforest cut down, then that would completely shift the dynamic and would hopefully bring us towards a brighter future.
Nations alone cannot implement plans. The scientists are really making a huge impact at the moment in the conservation of the biodiversity, because we alone, we can't keep up. We can database ourselves. We need big technology to gather all of these hundreds of thousands of records that make those really, really detailed maps that will help us to talk to government, to talk to other scientists, or to talk even to the community. We are in a big pressure to get data, to analyze, to say what's happening with the environment, but we are left resourceless, and so we are very slow. And it's every day we have less people working in science, believe it or not. So it's less capacity in the terms of science. We need to hurry up because the resources are not going to be there waiting for us forever.
Strengthening capacity can mean lots of things. It can mean skills, it can mean tech transfer, it can mean funds. It can also mean, I talked about biodiversity monitoring. It can mean giving people the tools to measure biodiversity, monitor biodiversity in a kind of responsive way, so that those areas can be managed up to a standard that we think is achievable and desirable, rather than being left in a kind of fixed state.
Data is a fundamental part that will help us to talk to government, to talk to other scientists, or to talk even to the community.
Data ultimately gives us an understanding of what biodiversity is out there, how it's changing, and from a policy perspective, it helps us understand, are our policies actually taking us on the direction we need to be going? So it's a way of validating policies, it's a way of course correcting where we need, and ultimately it gives us a sense of progress and a sense of how we're performing against a baseline.
The way we analysed the world database on protected areas and where countries hold the most ecosystem services, the way we analysed the biodiversity in those areas was using the Biodiversity Intactness Index. So this is also called the BII. And essentially, BII is a way of measuring ecosystem health. So it's not related to species specifically, but how is this particular area of land, because it's a terrestrial metric, how is this area of land faring? And very simply, BII takes a lot of complex data, a lot of complex statistics, and produces a very simple number between 0 and 100%. And that percentage represents the species that remain in that terrestrial area despite the impacts of humans. It harnesses all this on-the-ground biological data, I think now from over 6 million data observations, one of the most geographically and taxonomically representative databases of its kind in the world. If you're above 90%, you're in a functioning, thriving, healthy ecosystem. But then as that number gets lower, the ecosystem is becoming more degraded. And really, as you're getting below 30%, somewhat of an arbitrary number, but you're at the risk of that ecosystem collapsing. And all the ecosystem services us as humans rely on, gone. So we take all of that data, and then we model how the species fare, their abundance, and their composition. And then we take the results of those models, and that's what we use to project BII. And we can do that back to the year 2000 at a high resolution. But importantly, we can also project forward, and then we can essentially project how biodiversity is going to change based on these different scenarios. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're obviously biodiversity is declining, and I think the world at the moment has a BII of about 60%, which is way below where we want to be. So how do we bend that curve of biodiversity loss so we start to come out of it? And that's going to take time. Biodiversity and nature is slow to respond, especially the larger organisms, which have bigger generation times. How do we eventually bend that in the right direction?
It's very powerful looking backwards and looking forwards, as well as the snapshot in time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that snapshot in time is really important. Last year, we were fortunate enough that the BII got upgraded in the Global Biodiversity Framework to a component indicator. And I think the reason for that is the simplicity of it, because it is such an intuitive number, right? Number goes down equals bad, number goes up equals good. The other fact is, because it's a model-based metric, it means it can be applied globally. The whole way of the world, as I mentioned, is about 60%, or nationally, the UK is about 31%. And you can also go all the way down to 1 kilometre square, so this particular area here, how is that faring? The fact it can provide a holistic view for governments to make policy decisions on, also for businesses and financial institutions to make really nuanced day-to-day operational decisions on. Now, we're not saying that 100% should be the target. It can't be, otherwise there wouldn't be any humans on Earth. But as long as we're bending that curve, as I said, then we're going in the right direction.
One of the key hurdles, I would say, of COP16 is this question of funding and not being able to deliver funding to the right areas where it's needed most. One proposed solution to this funding gap is the concept of biodiversity credits. But how do they work? And where you see their strengths and some potential pitfalls?
So a lot of people may have heard of carbon credits, and we talk about the voluntary carbon markets, VCMs as they're called. So what are biodiversity credits? They're essentially the same thing, but rather than trying to increase carbon storage, to take it out of the atmosphere, we're trying to protect or preserve or restore biodiversity. Now, they're very new initiatives, right? People don't know all the answers yet. The financial institutions don't have the sort of confidence and trust in them yet that they need to build. But essentially, what we're asking here is the corporates of the world, the financial institutions of the world, you need to pump private capital into these projects. Biodiversity credits aren't about offsetting impact. They're about direct investment in nature projects for the sake of the investment, for the sake of preserving and restoring biodiversity. Now, you ask about some of the pitfalls, and we learned this from the voluntary carbon market. It's the misuse of credits, but it's also the potential for greenwashing. So how do we get them to invest? And this is the tricky part. So there have been some frameworks recently which have provided guidance, and I've been part of putting those together. And so things we would call for are transparency, right? Accountability, and I think importantly, rigorous third-party verification to ensure that what people are claiming is actually happening. We just need to make sure that the preservation and restoration is genuine. I think that's where technology can come in to help.
What do you see as the role of monitoring mechanisms, and what could those actually look like on the ground?
To get, I think, really comprehensive monitoring, you need a mixture of the hands-off approach as well as the hands-on. So one of the things we learned in the voluntary carbon markets is in certain countries, bad actors were destroying primary or secondary forests so they could sell those as credits for new trees to be planted, which is obviously horrendous, right? It's completely counterintuitive. And you can see that happening with biodiversity credits, right? So how do we stop that? Well, if we can show in this land, we'll look at the last 20 years, your BII has been above 80 in this area. Using satellite imagery, you could say, well, look, you've got all this forest here. You could use AI to detect how forests have started to change in the area. And now you're telling me you've got a completely degraded secondary forest. Well, how did that suddenly happen? I don't remember there being a wildfire here, or an earthquake, or another natural disaster. So is something underhand going on? And that will probably happen. And we can hopefully use the technology to hold those people who do that to account. So I think that's how monitoring can really help. And then by modeling that data, using AI and using machine learning, we're then able to project how that biodiversity is going to change. Now we use AI models to say how biodiversity is going to respond. Are we going in the right way? Importantly though, we need that full sat-nav for nature perspective. And this is where you need the on-the-ground collection of data. So 1 year is the baseline. You start to make your interventions. The investment's coming from capital in the private sector to fund that. Brilliant. Next year, we send a team in. You do your analysis. That data gets taken back, goes into the AI models. How's biodiversity doing? Are the policies working? Are the interventions working? Yes, right, continue, do it again. But then the next year we'll monitor it again. As you can continue to do that, you get this continuous cycles of enacting policies and interventions driven by financial investment, the continued cycle of collecting more and more data, modelling that data out, which then inform the interventions and the policies. So you create this really beautiful cycle of data monitoring, modelling and action, which ultimately protects and restores biodiversity.
Achieving 30 by 30 has to be about more than just percentages. So it has to be about protecting the right 30% in the right ways and doing that fast enough.
We are to protect the whole planet, so we need a huge recruitment of people to be conscious and to be engaged into conservation. We're going to lose all of those efforts if we go too slow.
It would be nonsensical to try and just expand a network of protected areas without giving people the tools to manage those effective areas well. Otherwise, we'll just see biodiversity declining in the ways that it, in some cases, already is.
From here, we have to take action. So it requires a whole of society approach.
It's all up to us, not just scientists, but governments, communities, to turn intentions into actions.
Everyone from governments and policymakers, academics and scientists, businesses such as corporates and financial institutions, NGOs and not-for-profits who should be holding up that North Star. Ultimately, we need everyone to act together. And businesses and finance need to understand that their entire systems, their entire product and supply chains are all founded in biodiversity.
We need to speed up, we need to invest, we need to increase the capacity, not just of people, but institutions and support. Because if we preserve the diversity, we provide a sustainable future for everybody, not just for the humans, but also for organisms and any life that exists in the planet.
So everyone needs to take actions, regardless of who you are, where you are, and what your age is. Because if we don't, tomorrow might not be here for our future generations.